to another edition of Bitterroot Views. I'm your host again, Norman Franklin. And we have in our studios tonight a gentleman by the name of Alan Biogo. How are you, Alan?
Just fine, thanks.
Alan, you're back by popular demand or request.
Well, thank you.
This is the third time you've been back to our studios, and again, you're returning from Bangladesh, is it, this time?
Yes. Earlier in March, April of 1990, I was requested to be a team leader for the United Nations to go to Bangladesh. And for those of you that don't know where Bangladesh is, it used to be called East Pakistan, and before that it was part of India. It lies, Burma is immediately to the east, and India is immediately to the west. Bangladesh is an interesting country. It has to be obviously the most crowded country on earth. In a space smaller than the area west of the divide in Montana, there are, last year's 110, now they say it's 118 million people.
Alan, how do you get to go to all these interesting places?
Well, in this case, it kind of came from the Vietnam experience. I went back for a meeting in New York State in 1989 after our 2 trips to Vietnam. And in a committee meeting, I met a lady from Bangladesh who was working for the United Nations, and she asked about my agricultural background, and I gave her some ideas, and she said, send me a resume. I didn't hear anything for a while, and then all of a sudden I got this phone call that said, would it be possible for you to be in Bangladesh by 20 March? And I said, well, I can try. And the next thing I knew, I had my passport in my hot little hand, and went by way of Tokyo, stopped in Bangkok to see my daughter there, and then went on into Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is about in the center of the country. And later,
is that the capital?
That's the capital. Bangladesh broke away from its association with West Pakistan, or what we now call just Pakistan, almost 20 years ago. And they've had a series of military coups, and since that time, President Ershad, who was in power when I was there, he was a general who took over. He has since been thrown out, and theoretically they'll have elections now, and it'll be a little more democratic. But it is a Muslim country, but the people themselves are quite a mixture of people, somewhat similar to the people of India, but very different from the people of Pakistan or Afghanistan.
In what way are they so different?
Well, in appearance, they're shorter and darker. They come from a mixture of peoples that have been there for a long time. They're related to the people of Sri Lanka, we used to call Ceylon, to the people of India. And apparently there were quite a few people, possibly from Africa, that came through there. Then on the extreme edges of the country, along the west edge, of course, are some Hindu people, and you can tell them by their dress. And along the extreme east are the hill tribes, who are related to the people of Burma, or what they now call Myanmar. And these are typical hill tribesmen that, as you find throughout Asia.
So there are different languages within this country then?
Yeah, the people of Bangladesh, English is probably the one language that the educated people have that they use in common. Otherwise it's Bangla, or it used to be called Bengali. It's related to Urdu, Hindi, Nepali, and it's basically an old Sanskrit language, and the writing is in Sanskrit.
So did you have trouble moving from community to community? Did you have trouble communicating?
Not much. I was really fortunate. My team, as I mentioned, I was a team leader. The team was made up of 4 French people, and these men had all been born, they were overseas French. One had been born in Vietnam, one in Tunisia, one in Morocco, one in Senegal. And they in turn were married, 2 of them were married to girls from the Alsace-Lorraine, which meant I could communicate to them in German. My French isn't terribly good, but they spoke almost perfect English. And then there were 2 Bangladeshis. One had gotten a PhD in Japan, so he also spoke fluent Japanese, and the other one was from right there.
Well, had any of these foreigners ever heard of the Bitterroot Valley?
Well, in fact, one of them, the engineer, had come through Butte, so he remembered Butte, which he apparently hit about St. Patrick's Day, and he was the kind of fellow that made the most of it. And the wife of the fellow who was born in Saigon had worked for a year in St. Louis and had also traveled through Montana. So, and they had a lot of pictures of Montana, or had seen pictures of Montana, so they were familiar with it.
I see. Well, now, did you bring slides with you again?
I did, and let's take a look at some of the slides that came from Bangladesh.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you on behalf of BVTV for bringing us all these slides and photographs and anecdotes and so on and so forth from all these four corners, literally four corners of the world. Thanks again.
You're more than welcome. This is the way that Bangladesh looks from the air, looking down where the Ganges and the Brahmaputra sweep out. And of course, 90% of Bangladesh is so flat that if the sea came up 6 feet, it would cover the country. The beaches are beautiful. Of course, this fronts on the Indian Ocean, as you can see here, and the sunsets are tremendous. One of the mornings when I woke up, it was kind of strange. I could see puffs of dust going by, and then this elephant that was tethered outside of where I was staying. The elephants are not terribly common there, but in this case, this fellow was using it both for tourism and doing other odd jobs around the place with it, and he'd tie it up at night nearby where we stayed. Bangladesh, of course, is a Muslim country, and you can see the green top of the mosque way in the background, and this is the Ghat, or the boat landing. With 5,000 people per square mile, you can see why everything is so tremendously crowded. And we traveled sometimes in boats like this and sometimes in boats that were better. The Bangladeshis themselves travel both by sail, as in the case of these falakas like this, which are similar to the boats you see all along the Arabic coasts. Another one is what we call a country boat like this, which is related to the Chinese junk. These are for more going out to sea. They have a diesel engine in them, a single cylinder that goes tunk, tunk, tunk as it goes along. But they're able to travel pretty well with them, and in fact the people, of course, live on them most of their lives. As we traveled around, we saw quite a few different things. My job mainly was to look at the shrimp culture, and we'll see some examples of that later on. But one of the interesting side things was salt harvesting. These little miniature paddies are filled with seawater by the boys. It's lifted in by hand or by very primitive means, and then the sun beats down on it, and eventually salt is harvested. Everything is done by hand. We never saw much heavy equipment. In fact, the only heavy equipment I ever saw, no bulldozers, nothing like that. The only thing I saw was a roller. Otherwise, everything is chopped, cut, dug by hand, and then carried. And this is the way dikes are built, roads are built, and everything else. The clay, in this case, is so sticky that it's cut with a spade and then handed from person to person, just like a big block. Now in this case, we're looking across the bay there to Burma, now called Myanmar. We were way down at a place called Teknaf, which is as far southeast as you can go and still be in Bangladesh. It sort of points down toward Malaysia and Indonesia. These people, the two men in the white shirts, were farmers, fairly prosperous, who were going out to check their salt farms. The building in the background that you see is where the farmhands live. This is part of my team. The salt, you can see, is just about ready to harvest. The two Bangladeshis here were just checking it to make sure that it was okay. The stores, there are a lot of stores in Bangladesh, and they're small like this, and you can see all the different kind of fruits hanging up. Meat is hung up like this. Of course, it gets covered with flies pretty fast. And because it's a Muslim country, you do not see any women. Almost never did I see a woman. I could go days without seeing one. And the shops, the markets, everything is done mainly by young men. And this is a typical store. You see a man sitting behind the counter there. And this is an array of goods. The yellow cans are have Red Cow brand milk from Australia in them, either powdered milk or condensed milk. And they sell cigarettes and other canned goods like that. This is an example of seeing women who are a little older. These are girls probably 16 or 17. They're completely in chador, that is, they have wear their black and they wear a veil, and in this case they're carrying an umbrella, which is somewhat tattered for wear. And since this was part of the dry season, the fields themselves were quite dry. And you see cattle grazing everywhere, in the streets, downtown, all over the place. This is what one of the streets was like, and these are females that are under the age of puberty, so they were running in front of our vehicles. We quickly discovered why there are no rear view mirrors on any vehicle, because the drivers try to put them down through here 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, and people simply have to dodge out of the way. Everything is walled in, of course, because people are constantly on guard against thieves and things like that. These were the young men who both were harvesting salt, and in this case were gathering shrimp. Now, the big white jar contains shrimp larvae. They're so small, they're about the size of half of a sewing needle. But little boys have nets all along the seacoast, and the waves wash the shrimp fry into there, and they call these boys fry catchers. And then the older boys help sort them, and then finally they're turned loose into the paddies, and the shrimp grow then to full size. And many of the shrimp that you see even in this country now, the large tiger shrimp, are actually from Bangladesh. Here people were releasing the shrimp into the pond. Now this pond is kept strictly for the raising of shrimp. They have to let them in there very gently, get the shrimp fry, can't have too much temperature change or anything like that. But it is going to eventually make Bangladesh a very important source of shrimp for the entire world, and it can be done at a much lower cost than, say, in the Philippines, Thailand, or Taiwan. The fellow in the striped shirt, the Caucasian, was one of the French guys, Philippe Céline, who was born in Vietnam back in 1940 and sort of lives all over the world. This is the way we traveled a good bit of the time. We had what we call the Boston Whaler. These are faster boats than the country boats that you saw. They have a real high-powered motor on them. And then we got caught in the rains. The rains sometimes can be tremendous, and they'll rain like a foot an hour. Here we got into this cluster, sort of a compound of farm dwellings, just as the rain really came thundering down on us. And when we had to move from place to place, it was to move in muck like this, because the tide was down, of course, and two guys that sort of sacrifice themselves drop into the knee-deep stinking muck and then hand the other guys over to the prow of the Boston Whaler. This was a case where storms kept sweeping over us, and of course these are the very same storms which killed hundreds and thousands of people, because they're all on these islands hundreds of miles from land that's over much more than 3 feet above sea level. We started going into the teeth of another storm. It is the gale was kicking up, although the sun was still shining. And then the sea began to really get rough, and Philippe Almy, another one of the French guys, we'd gotten onto a bigger boat. He was getting quite concerned. Soon after this, he ended up steering, because the boatman, the Bangla boatman, ran through 2 sets of nets and over a bamboo log and about shipwrecked us. We found out, although we couldn't see it through the storm, that a boat rolled over, a country boat, and 100 people drowned not very far away from us. And when we came in, we were both like drowned rats. My friend there in the orange shirt was a French engineer who had come through Montana at one time, and he'd stopped in Butte, and he thought it was great. The vehicle we have there is the United Nations, has the United Nations logo, because this is under the United Nations, of course, and we traveled around in them. And of course, being in Bangladesh, the steering wheel is over on the right-hand side. Half the world, you know, drives on the same side as the British, and half the same side as we do. Takes a little getting used to. Some of the projects we went out to look at looked like this, and this is a case, this has all been dug by hand. These are canals. The canals will control the water, and you have great tidal changes, and once people can make them work, then the tide can work with them. Now here were Bangladeshi farmers, and they were showing off the gate system, and anybody who understands flood irrigation in the Bitterroot would be very familiar with the kind of gate that they're looking down at there. As farmers get older, they do less and less work, and they all wear skirts, you notice. Almost never did we see anybody wearing a pair of trousers. These are farmers that are gathered to look at a video about shrimp culture. Now, the most senior person is a fellow in white sitting in front. He's allowed to grow a beard. He wears a little white cap. He's sort of like an imam or like a deacon. And he doesn't do any kind of work anymore. He just reads the Quran. And the others are aspiring. They start to grow a beard as they get older. And then way in the back are the little boys who are the fry catchers. Now, about half of the people in Bangladesh could read or write something, but the use of videos was very important. If they didn't have electricity, they'd have a generator, a monitor, and a video machine, and that way they would be able to transmit all kinds of educational stuff through their extension service. And they had a very good extension service, by the way. We were also traveling near what they call the Chittagong Hills. Here you can see barreling down the road, there are cattle in the road. Every once in a while we tick one. And when you meet people on the road, this is where you lose your mirrors, because you come so close to each other that it snaps the rear of your mirrors off both vehicles as we meet on the road. This is an area also that's pretty heavy with dacoits or bandits. And in fact, later on you'll see a picture of an extension worker who got shot up by the dacoits as he was trying to travel by bus. So it's a fairly dangerous country. Some of the country looks just like Vietnam. This is rice paddy area. You can see the dikes and you can see the paddy fields and the trees, and in the distance are the Chittagong Hills, which lead on into Burma. As you got over in here, we started to see signs of Buddhist culture. When we were working on the projects, this is a concrete gate being poured. The poor water buffalo calf is wandering around there. I don't think it ever found anything to eat there. But when the gate is done, this is the way it looks, and it'll control the seawater, the salt water coming in, and during the heavy rains, it'll have to be lifted, because if you get 5 or 6 feet of rain during a day, you have to lift the gates to let the water out of the polder areas. The polders are somewhat the same as in Holland. You'll have 2, 3, 4, 5,000 hectares, that is 4, 5, 6, 7,000 acres, that are enclosed by these high dikes, and then the farmers can control the water by the way they run the gates up and down. And remembering that half the year it's totally dry, and half the year you have drenching rain. Here we are moving again through the muck, trying to hop from boats off the dikes and back up and down again. Because we're looking at shrimp, you won't be able to see them, of course, but in this laboratory jar are all kinds of tiny baby shrimp. They've just been hatched. And there you can see at the bottom what we call hen shrimp. Now these shrimp are so big, they're actually almost the size of lobsters. They're almost a foot long. And when they get ready to shed their eggs, they'll lay about 1 million eggs. And as with guppies and things like that, you have to remove the mother just before she sheds her eggs, or her mates will eat up all the eggs right away. Interestingly enough, in each of the hatcheries, they had one woman there. And the woman, these were young women, usually had a bachelor's in biology or something like that, and they didn't have their faces veiled, and they were by far the best at hatching out shrimp. They get 80–90% success, and the men working in the same hatchery maybe do half as well. Now here's a shrimp. You can see the size of it just at the bottom of the screen. It's almost a foot long, and this farmer is the one who raised it, and of course he's very proud of that shrimp. And this one is a catchable size that can be hauled to market. Ironically, because they're Muslims, they can't eat the shrimp, because this is a crawling creature that has no red blood, and therefore Muslims are forbidden to eat such things. We ate them, though. This is the interior of what they called makeshift hatcheries, and it is interesting because it was done with 2,000 American dollars. The hatchery was about 40 feet wide and about 100 feet long, made of bamboo and plastic, and they used old Canadian canola barrels, and then they had a recycling system which is in the center, because of course it has to be salt water, and they recycled and cleaned the salt water, same as you would in a tropical fish tank. These were people that were working near where I was staying, and since there's no machinery, all those people are picking up dirt at the right-hand side and carrying it in baskets to the left-hand side of the picture. And that's what they do until they finally dug a ditch. Thousands and thousands of workers. And of course it makes sense when you have millions of people that could possibly be thrown out of work. Better to do it all by hand than to import any machinery and try to do it. And this is the way they haul stuff around. We'd see carts like this. Now that's a full load of barrels, and once that guy gets going, he just has to keep moving along. His momentum and his little boy there are sort of helping him. I don't know how much that load weighed, but it must have been plenty heavy. These are the farm villages that we saw as we went way out along the waterways down toward the Sundarbans, or the tiger jungle as they called it. This is an extreme southern Bangladesh, not too far from India. In fact, it's about 100 or 200 miles east of Calcutta. This is what the towns look like, very crowded, lots of buses coming and going. The tops of the bus is empty right now, but typically people would fill the bus, then they climb on top, then they finally hang off both sides. And a bus like the one in the picture there may contain as many as 150 people. Now you can see the Bengali script there. Now I couldn't read that, and then that particular village, of course, there was nothing in English, so without my Bangla friends, we'd have been in tough shape. This is the way they haul logs in Bangladesh. Those are coming out of the Sundarbans, and of course they lose a number of people every year to the tigers. You know, a young man takes off from the northern part of the country, and after 5 or 10 years, if he never comes home again, they assume that the tigers got him. And these people are coming in about 100 miles, pulling those pieces of logs on that rubber-tired cart. And then here is the sawmill. They have no big sawmills. What they have is kind of like a giant bandsaw, and it takes about 6 or 8 guys to lift it up to the bandsaw, and then they push it through by hand. And again, everything is done by hand. And this is the real kicker. There is no rock in Bangladesh, no gravel or anything like that, because the entire thing is a muddy clay area. So rock like this was hauled in from Burma or some other place. Since they have no gravel, the guy sitting under the umbrella is making little ones out of big ones. They sit there, and they also make bricks, and they pound them apart like this, and that makes their aggregate. They spend an entire lifetime taking egg-shaped rocks and beating them down to sand. That's what they're doing. A lot of the country is pretty like this. It's very green. The railroad runs on the right side, the road on the left side, and this hollow in between has all been dug by hand. And the bridges were kind of like this. You notice the railway tracks run on the bridge too. And so we had to watch, and then there were signals, and there's just a few people on top of the bus, but I've seen rows 4 deep hanging on each side of the bus, and then everybody on the top standing, and it's kind of like with the dogs in the Bitterroot that stand on top of a truck cab. If you have to dynamite the brakes or swing a sharp corner, everybody spills off into the ditch, and then the bus driver has to stop, and everybody has to pick themselves up and crawl back on top of the bus again. We were there during the time of Ramadan, which is the time when Muslims fast during the day. Everywhere we went, there were speakers going on. And if you understand something about the Quran, they were reciting from the Quran. But one of the fellows looks like he's getting a little bit of sleep because the harangue goes on endlessly, and I suppose they take turns on the loudspeaker. But we were never out of sight of loudspeakers. And of course, at 4:30 in the morning, the first call to prayers came, and that's what woke us up. And 5 times a day, everybody goes for prayer. The men do. The women are out of sight. And we would sort of get ourselves tucked safely out of the way so we wouldn't offend them. This is what a lot of the people live in, shacks with plastic covers. And here are more people living in one of the cities, in this case, Khulna, and then the tower in the back where the mullah, of course, calls the faithful to prayer. This is the way most of the people travel around, in rickshaws. You can't even see the guy on the front in the bicycle, but this is loaded with baskets. And rickshaws are very common everywhere. Now, the more wealthy folks have oxen like this pulling their carts. And the towns were sometimes crowded and sometimes very muddy, as you can see here. And you run into situations like this. If you've seen an Indiana Jones movie, I finally figured out you can go through a marketplace at 60 miles an hour, because we were bombing through here at a pretty high rate of speed, and somehow the bicyclist with his cart in front got out of our way, and we missed that truck. And the trucks will have several people on top. There'll be one guy driving, two in the front assisting him, and then people on top waving directions and asking us turn signals. And as you can see, they love to decorate their trucks very ornately. Most of the trucks were made either in Japan or in India. These are the folks that are battering bricks apart. Bricks are made from the clay, and then they pound them back apart into aggregate like this. And this is the one case where we saw a road building. Now the tar is heated in barrels over little wooden fires, and then people carry it in pails, spread it on the highway, and the bricks are incorporated in, and in this case they did have a roller, and we had to dodge around this all the time with the vehicles that we were traveling in. Then we traveled actually mostly by boat. Here we're going into an area of polders, and here the walls have been built up to try to keep the sea out. And yet you figure 30 or 40 years ago, this was the bottom of the sea. All that silt that's been washed out is what's been built up, and people actually move out and live on these mud islands even before the silt is settled. And of course, walking around in the muck, we had to get ourselves washed off, but they actually did have water, fresh water here, with what they called boreholes or drilled wells. This was the headquarters. This was the kind of places we would stay in when we were way out on the islands or way in distant places. Actually quite good, made of thatch. The breezes could play through it, so it was not too hot in there, even in the hottest of weather. And the weather got down to about 80 at night and up to about 100 or 105 during the daytime. We're sitting here talking to farmers. The fellow on the extreme left was the fellow I reported to. He was from the People's Republic of China, and has since managed to get him to the United States. The farmers were pretty articulate, and they were certainly willing to report everything that they thought was right or wrong with the way the government was handling things. Here we're out trying to catch some shrimp. The fellow has a net, and he's just thrown it out. He's drawing it in. And there are the shrimp laying on the ground. Now, these aren't quite as big as the last one. These are probably as big as what you'll see at a store, but they said, oh, they're not big enough, and they threw them all back in. Give them another 2 months to grow till they're almost the size of small lobsters in America. And here's Mr. Wong holding up one of the shrimp. This one also got tossed back with the Bangladeshis looking on. The area that was enclosed by this polder was about 2,000 hectares, or about 5,000 acres. And it had been very carefully built up. Everything was carefully regulated, just like the best flood irrigation system you'd ever see in the Bitterroot. People have their houses out here, and at this moment, because this is a dry season, actually all they were doing was raising shrimp in all of these areas. So for them, it is a very important commodity. The engineer, this is the fellow with the California farmer's cap on there, translated for me. The farmers and some of the older farmers pointed out that they were very, very grateful for the help from America. And this is something I found in most countries. The very common people, if they've ever been helped by Americans, they always remembered it. And they said in their case they had been given 2 years of food for peace food, and so instead of planting crops, they built the dikes all around their island, which of course made it possible for them to live. And one fellow came up, shook my hand and said, please tell people in America you have made our life possible, and we are so grateful. And which is kind of a nice thing to hear, of course. And back to the boats again, wading through the knee-deep muck. And it's about the consistency of chewing gum, so it really sticks to you. It takes a while to get it off again. Here we're back at sort of a headquarters area. The fellow on the extreme left with the bandage on his arm is the extension worker who was shot through the arm by the bandits, and the fellow on the extreme right is his supervisor. And these are the kind of things we stayed in. Certainly plenty good guest housing for us while when we got back to where things were a little more civilized. They had electricity and running water, and in this case a sea breeze. The downtowns in Bangladesh looked like this: cows wandering around, lots of rickshaws, lots of people walking around, and they slowly build, as you can see. They'll build one story, and then they'll keep adding concrete pillars and roofs, and finally they'll brick it in, and then the next story gets built, and so it goes on up. When we were coming back from Teknaf, we traveled along the longest, widest beach in the world. It's a beautiful beach, about 100 kilometers long, about 60 miles, and at times it'll be almost a mile wide when the tide goes down. And so we rolled along at 100 kilometers, 120 kilometers an hour in our land cruisers, or 60, 70 miles an hour. And just kept rolling in a convoy like this. And we had to travel in convoy because it's not safe to travel alone there. And then, halfway along, the French wives had us stop. And of course, being French people, they were superb cooks, and they had these beautiful lobsters. Lobsters, of course, were very cheap. They cost about 20 takas, or about 60 cents a piece, because they figured out that Muslims wouldn't eat them, but you could get them in the market. And so the French women cooked them up and had them ready for us here. And had just a nice picnic by the seaside. So this was after all the heat and the dust and sweat and everything like that. It was nice to stop in the shade and rest for a little bit. But this was really a working trip for 6 weeks, gathering information, and finally I had to make a report to the United Nations and to the Council of Ministers of the Republic. One of the side things that was kind of interesting were the farmers who had started to build shrimp nurseries. And in this case, they're bringing in baby shrimp and putting them in those tanks. Then they're raised until they get big enough, and they in turn sell them to the farmers when they're about an inch long, and the farmers turn them loose in the rice paddies. This fellow is counting the shrimp as they come in. Now, how they could do it, I don't know, but he'd sit there and pay them. I think they got 100 takas for 1,000 baby shrimp, which is pretty good earning for the people that were selling it, because the average person only earns $1 or $2 a day at the very most. And one of the little French boy, the only child I saw that was not Asian, was Christophe. Christophe was 6 years old, and he was quite a little fellow. He'd come down in the morning and he'd say, "Bonjour, maman," and all that sort of thing. And I'd say, "How are you, Christophe?" And he'd say, "Oh, I'm very well, thank you." And of course his mother spoke German at home, so he could speak 3 languages, and I'm sure he spoke Bangla to the Bangladeshis around him. And here he's looking at the shrimp. Of course you can't see him from this distance. This is a part of the shrimp farm also, and apparently somebody took the old metal forms for 1938 Dodge trucks over there, because they did actually assemble a truck in Bangladesh on an Indian chassis, but the bodywork looks exactly like our old Dodge farm trucks from before the Second World War. The people themselves, of course, are very interesting, and attractive people. The little fellow here is just sort of staring off. He hadn't figured out who I was. Unfortunately, another little boy came along minding his own business, and I squatted down to take a picture of him, and he was perhaps 3 years old. And when I snapped the picture, he let out a howl and he went running home again as fast as his little legs could carry him. I'm sure he had never seen a Westerner before. This was probably the only teenage girl I ever saw, and she was obviously a Hindu, and she was sitting along the road selling things and would allow her picture to be taken. In the meetings with the farmers, very often we had to go in there, and sometimes they were not too attracted by what we had to visit with them about. In this case, land tenure was an issue, and the old fellow sitting there in the white was talking about enemy lands, and finally we figured out this was land owned by Hindus who had fled in 1947, and they still called it enemy lands, but he didn't want anybody checking any closer because he was farming the land. He'd simply taken it over 40 years ago and wasn't telling anybody, the government or anything else, how he was running it, and wasn't paying anybody any rent. Here they are sitting, watching the pictures, looking at the videos, and you can see some scribbling on the wall. This is a typical classroom. It does have a blackboard, and of course, again, video is a good form of instruction. Well, now we're getting toward the end of the trip. These are the fly catchers stretched out along the beach in the far distance, catching the tiny little shrimp fly. And the sun is slowly setting as only it can over the teeming, crowded city of Dhaka. And this is the end of the trip to Bangladesh.